and those who are sharing their voice with us tonight are doing something brave and bold. We will embrace our humanness as well and remember that there will likely be a technology hiccup or two, or perhaps one of my children needing attention in the middle of our town hall. All that will be fine. Pastor Monique will not be joining us today due to a family emergency. And so keep her family in your prayers during this time. And with that, I turn tonight's conversation over to the Reverend Nicole Garcia.
Sorry, this is JJ. Before we begin, I just want to make sure that I have access to the, for some reason it's not popping up right now.
The closed captioning? Okay, I'll reinstall you right now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, JJ's being reinstalled. Thank you, Megan. Megan and I go back a few days. I'm Nicole Garcia. I am the pastor for mission development at Westview Church and ELCA congregation in Boulder, Colorado. I have been active in the ELCA since about 2003. I officially became a Lutheran in 2003, having been baptized and raised in the Roman Catholic Church until my early 40s, in which time I jumped ship and became a Lutheran. I also happen to be a licensed professional counselor in the state of Colorado. I work with a small practice called the Umbrella Collective, where I see a few counseling clients, and I'm also a clinical supervisor. I've been very active in the ELCA and in the counseling practice over the last several years. So here I am finally, Pastor Nicole. So I'm going to go to my right. Francisco, would you introduce yourself?
So my name is Francisco Herrera. My pronouns are he, him, and mother. I'm a PhD student currently at the Lutheran Seminary here in Chicago. My interests are in intersectionality and mission and evangelism. In terms of me, my background's in classical music. I'm a classically trained violist and orchestra conductor. I speak quite a few languages because I've traveled around a lot. But I have a very, very deep love of the church, and this is where eventually God brought me. And my interest in working specifically among the Lutherans is because in terms of theology, this is really kind of where it's at for me. We just have a way of talking about Jesus and talking about God that takes in count the whole person. And so, of course, for me, it is really frustrating to see how often people of color and queer folks are treated in this church. And this is one of the reasons why I have dedicated myself to decolonizing Lutheranism for several years now. And it is really very much an honor and a pleasure to be here on this panel with all of you. You've been some of my favorite people for a while.
Thank you, Francisco. And Padre Angel.
Thank you. I'm Padre Angel. I'm in beautiful and sunny Boston, Massachusetts. Today, I am a third-generation Lutheran from Puerto Rico. I am a son and the product of the Lutheran Church in the Caribbean. My background is in education and, of course, theology later on. I came to this place in New England because I said to the Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia at that time that I wanted to go anywhere for my internship but Massachusetts. I was not gonna come north because it was cold and too far from Puerto Rico. So that being said, 6 years later, I'm still here doing ministry. I serve as the pastor developer of Santuario Luterano in Waltham, a suburb of the city of Boston. And recently I was appointed also as the priest in charge of Christ Church in Hyde Park, a neighborhood of Boston, and also of Iglesia Episcopal San Juan. Both together are, both congregations worship in the same building and are part of the same at-large community. And I'm so delighted to be here, to meet you, Nicole, and of course to see Francisco again.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'm surprised we haven't run into each other, Padre Angel, through the years we've both been working in the church. Francisco and I have, we've never been in the same room together.
Not yet.
We've never shaken hands, but we have been in contact for a while.
A while now.
A while.
Well, me and Padre también. We first met each other about, well, it was 3 years ago almost, right?
Yep.
He came and he was so pretty. He had this black cassock in.
You know.
La dignidad, right? It's just, I loved it.
My brothers and sisters from Mexico call me La Diva, but you know.
Live into it.
Yeah.
Embrace it. Yeah. Yeah. And we were talking a little bit earlier about how Lutherans tend to gravitate towards lower church, and Episcopal Church tends to gravitate towards higher church. I, being raised a Catholic, when I went through my gender transition, and I didn't believe I would be able to go back to the Roman Catholic Church, not necessarily because I was transgender, but because I was divorced. And so when I asked a friend about what church they go to, they told me about a Lutheran church in downtown Denver. And the reason why I stayed was because the pastor there celebrated high church. So
there are quite a few high church Lutherans. Oh yes.
Mm-hmm.
I remember.
So, you know, at the end of the day, high church is just church.
Mm-hmm.
All of it is just church, and all of it's expression.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the biggest gifts that Lutheranism gives to the world is that that our unity is on theology, sort of, and not so much in the forms of worship.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions that Megan had proposed really addresses this. How do the intersections of our identities shape the way we are Lutheran? And for me, my grounding in being raised by very strong, passionate, dedicated, and devoted women in my life. My mother, my grandmother, my aunts. I still have a rosary on my wall because my mother would say a rosary every day of her life. And my grandmother said a rosary every day of her life. And you notice the Guadalupe. I was born in December 12th. So yo soy una Guadalupana. And so Guadalupe has guided me my entire life. And so my identity as a Latina and as a Guadalupana, that definitely influences how I see myself as a Lutheran.
Yeah. You know, for me, I too was born on December 12th.
What?
Yes,
oh my God!
Yes.
Es un milagro!
I know. I'm here trying to so I was born on December 12th. A lot of I think that my grounding comes from being an Afro-Caribbean in terms of all my intersectionalities. I think that I learned that I was, or better said, when I was growing up, I always conceived myself as Black. In Puerto Rico, people talk to me as a Black man, and not as a negative thing, but a sense of pride of being Black, of those roots. And then when I went to seminary and I started talking about my Blackness, I remember professors and people telling me that I was not Black, that I was brown. And where I come from, any other shade from pure white is just Black. And it took me a couple of years to be able to reclaim that identity and to be able to raise it up as an Afro-Caribbean man, and someone that's proud of that heritage and the unique voice that my heritage brings to the wider church, and to not see it so much as a circus, as something unique to be watched by the real institutional church, but actually as a spirit-led movement within the life of the church. If anything, more transformative and more powerful than many other segments of the denomination.
Thank you, Padre. And Francisco, you talked about decolonizing Lutheranism.
Yes. Well, Well, specifically how intersectionality plays out with me. In some respects, Padre, it's a similar story to yours. I was never comfortable calling myself a Latino until I was almost 40. Because even though clearly my name is Francisco Herrera, right? You know, my father's Mexican, my mom's Portuguese. But because my father was horrifically abusive to my family, tried to kidnap me when I was 6, it was dangerous for me to be in the Mexican American community as a child. And so, and because my mom wanted me to have a proper education, of course, I was surrounded by whiteness. So I never had the ability to really connect with the Latino community growing up. And whenever I tried, it was hard because, you know, the Latino kids that I knew growing up made fun of me because I was so white-skinned and didn't speak Spanish. But the white kids made fun of me for being a dumb Mexican, so whatever. But this has to do with my sexuality too. I spent a great deal of time in my teens and my 20s, either fighting or being attacked or really kicking ass. These guys really don't realize just because I'm effeminate doesn't mean you can push me around. But my sexuality was a really important part of my life as well. But these aren't things you can't tell by looking at me. And there are benefits that I have, there are privileges that I have because I'm a Latino that passes as white, and I'm a queer man that passes as heterosexual. And though I have suffered under these things, there are still privileges I have because people see me the way that they do. And intersectionality is a way, combined with Lutheranism, right, the whole sinner saint thing, that intersectionality, and specifically intersectional Lutheranism, is some place that helps because it allows me to have the ground of righteous anger necessary to be a voice pressing against discrimination because of what I feel and how I am being treated, but also allows me to acknowledge the ways in which I have been raised to benefit from these ways that white cis heteronormative patriarchy beats up on people, and that I then in turn can look at people who are white and straight and say, don't you dare tell me you don't have to think about these things. I had to think about these things and I ain't even white and straight, as I look in the camera. But intersectionality allows me to do that. And it's been really, really helpful over the course of the last few years as I've been really working hard to what this means. Is it possible to have Lutheranism that's decolonized? And so I'm very happy to be here talking with my brothers and my sisters today. I can't hear you.
Unmute. Yeah. And so each one of us have worked in different areas of the church. And I think people have to realize there is no one definition of Latinx or Latino. Just in my life, you know, I am 60 years old. I was born and raised in Boulder, Colorado. In the 60s, we were Mexicans. And then in the 70s, we became Mexican Americans. And then some of us became Chicanos because we were socially active. And then in 1980, we magically became Hispanic because we had to be counted in the census. And then now I became Latino, then Latina, and Latinx. And half the time I don't know how to refer to myself. And Padre Angel, how you identify yourself is completely different, even though people would assume that we were all the same because my name is Garcia. It's a name that was originally started in Spain, right? So we should have so much in common. But is that true?
Absolutely. And the way that a blanket is thrown over all of us, right? Mm-hmm. I still struggle with identifying myself as Latino, to go over with what Francisco said, because the way I am Puerto Rican.
Right.
I don't know what oftentimes I'm like, I don't know what a Latino is. I have things in common with Mexicans and with Guatemalans. Like, to my eyes, there is a lot of similarities between white Americans and white Canadians and Brits, bunch of white people to me in a variety of ways, lack of seasoning, among other things. But I am, I have a distinct identity. When I see the banner Latino, it's that weird sense of, I know you're talking about me, but it doesn't feel like me. That is not who I am. My identity is much more complicated like that, than that, much more nuanced than that. And it's interesting because oftentimes when I see a lot of outrage, especially related to language, it comes from people that don't look like me, or they're like any of us, nor any of our variants within it, but almost like a colonization from the inside. You know, as if the white people have decided that stressing too much about this type of nuances within the language in this way is the thing to do. So now our people are also doing it, as opposed from the people organizing and finding what are their concerns.
Right. And actually,
they might be.
And then actually like doing things to address the concerns, as opposed to having a conference over what bloody word to use in a social statement that nobody is going to read anyway. Excuse me.
Francisco.
Perdóname, Padre.
No, you read them before going to bed every night.
I hope our audience at home has realized at this point, clearly we have a bunch of Latinos talking right now.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
But I, you know, I think Nicole brings that. It's so important what you said in terms of like, the more your life kept advancing, these blankets were thrown over you and you had no input within it. No. They try to, in a way, define you so that they can hold you.
Right.
And then, of course, our identity always rebels against being held. And if it's all of us, when we have filed a census or any type of form and it says, are you Hispanic or Latino? And then we go, I guess yes. And then it says, define your race.
Right.
And then we say, well, I don't define, no.
And what I find, you know, being a member of the Lutheran ELCA is that there are people within our denomination that do have very strong cultural and ethnic ties. You definitely know who are the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Danes, the Germans. You know, I had a friend who said, yeah, I came from a mixed family. My mother was Norwegian, my father was Swedish, and it was a big deal. But there's
it is. For them, it's a huge deal.
And I cannot say that, you know, it's important to know your culture and your ethnicity, but it's also important for everyone else to know that just because we have Spanish surnames doesn't mean we have a common culture or common heritage.
Exactly.
My family, we can trace our way, both sides of my family, to Taos, New Mexico in the 1760s. And my family, from everything we can tell, became, at least my father's, my grandmother's mothers, they all came from New Mexico. My great-grandfather, my mother's side, came from Italy. So my mother claims Spanish and Italian. And then everybody forgets about the native blood in our family, because it was never encouraged to claim our native heritage. And Padre Angel, you come from the Caribbean.
Yeah. Well, and how this is so deeply related to the life that we live as leaders in the church. From my perspective, I think of my current call. What the church said was that I am a developer to develop a new congregation among the Latino community. And 5 years into it, I'm still trying to figure out, what does it mean? What does it mean? How can I do church with all the Latinos? You know, I understand certain contexts, Puerto Rican, first generation, immigrants, and so, you know, people that kind of are similar to my parents, I can grasp it. So Guatemalans are different than me. You know, different cultural context, different cultural nuances. And in a way, what we are demanding, what we have a right for, is the same spaces that the white immigrants have. When the Germans came together, they went to the church, and the church was a form in which they connected with the larger culture and passed the wisdom of the culture to their children, and they heard their language, and they thought about the motherland, and they did dinners, and they did parties and dances and all that. And all we are demanding, all that is our right, is to do exactly the same thing without it being questioned. You know, without somebody coming in and saying, a Virgin of Guadalupe, is that Lutheran? I've never seen a Virgin of Guadalupe Lutheran. Well, I've never seen a boat hanging from a church until I went into a Norwegian the Sun church. And then I'm like, I guess Lutherans do that too.
Yeah. And so part of the question, one of the questions is how can the ELCA minimize bias? And that's one question I've asked myself for years. How do we recognize and value all of our different cultural and ethnic backgrounds? How can we recognize them and still come together as a church? Because one thing that I've heard many, many times through social statements, through synod assemblies, church-wide assemblies, is how can we increase diversity in our church? And I remember there was an assembly where we wanted 10% of the ELCA to be diverse, whatever that meant. I think we're maybe at what, 3%?
Ooh.
Oh, Francisco, I lost you again. So the question is, how do we recognize? Yes, there you go.
Okay.
How can we recognize our differences, lift up our differences, and still live within the same, under the same roof, so to speak? Even though now we're all under different roofs, but come together on the internet. What keeps us together?
Whew.
Padre?
Well, I think that first and foremost, we need to socialize power. And the power in the ELCA, by and large, is still white and is still over 60. And for as long as that is the reality, for as long as we keep electing old men as bishops and white people as bishops everywhere, really the system is going to be entrenched into them. Where for as long as when we hire DEMs, it is still people that reflect more or less the same demographic, then there won't be real change. We need the power structures and the power holders to look different. And that's first and foremost. The change cannot be cosmetic. Inviting me or Nicole or Francisco to a meeting so that we can represent that magic 10%, that is not enough. We need to be intentional in this region. You know why? Because when I walk, still the best model of ministry for the mainline church is the 30-year-old, recently graduate white guy who is straight and his wife is pregnant and they come for their first call, and then suddenly the 20 more families join and nobody knows. It must be that he's a great preacher. No, the young families pass by and they see a leader that looks like them and they feel identify with that. So the change is not going to come until the top looks more like the bottom we want to reflect, you know, and that is a change of paradigms in a lot of what we're talking. Just singing the songs is not enough. Just having the gringo pararse a decir que la liturgia es un modelo de vida que nos va and that's just not enough. It's not enough. And when I talk about power, I'm not only talking about decision power, I'm talking the money. Unless they trust us with the money, I don't think there'll be real change.
Yeah, and I agree that, you know, we have to be upfront, and it's always been hard being one of the front runners, being one of the leaders, and it is important. I have to say, I have been a token on so many boards and so many meetings, and that's a position that I've grudgingly lived into, because I think it's important for people to see someone who looks like them at the pulpit. But what I want to see is when you go to a synod assembly and one of us are talking, that the people who are on the tables from Pacific Lutheran and Luther Seminary, they're actively looking at and encouraging people of color to go to seminary.
Yes.
You know,
and they have the money there for you. And they have the money there for you, so you don't have to go $50,000 in the debt to get a degree and take on loads of debt that most white seminarians don't have to, because they either have families that help to pay for their food, parents who help to pay for their housing, grandparents who pay for their meal tickets. And so, I mean, like, yes.
Or they're gonna have cushy, nice first calls and second calls that will afford them to pay the money back, because truth be told, first call young white people, or white people in general, still get the best calls. Still get the first dibs in the calls. And the bishops, you know, I don't really think they sit down and think, ha 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 ha, we're going to screw the people of color. It is just embedded in the system, and they can see it.
Embedded in the system. And why don't more Latinx individuals go to seminary? Because you have to have an undergraduate degree.
Right.
And how many of us were really encouraged? Out of my 41 first cousins, I think 5 of us have an advanced degree. And I'm the second one to get a graduate degree. You know, out of 41.
Yeah, I'm the first person in my family to go to college.
Me too.
First one to go to college.
So. And because all of my cousins, all my male cousins were encouraged to go into the military, because that's where their
all my uncles and
fathers,
my dad.
that's where
all my uncles and my dad.
Because that's where they all got their educations.
Yep.
That's my father, my stepfather, all my uncles, they all got their GED when they went into the military. Because instead of going to high school, where did they go? The fields. They had to make a living.
But also in all that, as we talk about the educational standards, we have to also consider how, when there are clergy from sister and brother Lutheran churches in Latin America, to give an example, and we can recruit them because we just don't see their degrees and their ordinations as valid. And then we can get creative in a variety of ways when it suits a white person. You know, a white person can be a heretic and say all sorts of things, but a faithful Latin American pastor from Colombia that is raised at the Lutheran church, no, he or she or they need new Lutheran education. We got to make sure that they read their Cold Wingard, because whatever they read in Spanish doesn't seem to be enough. And as long as we keep treating our sisters and brothers with that optic of suspicion, we ain't gonna advance, because on the one hand, we're saying, come study. On the other hand, there are people that will be eager to come and do ministry here among the communities that are just culturally competent to do it. But and because we say the ordination invalid, ain't good enough.
Right.
Yeah, they read too much
for Colombia, but not for the United States.
They read too much liberation theology and not enough Bonhoeffer.
Jesus.
Was that too much in your face?
Yeah.
So what's the next step? We were talking before, Francisco, about both sociology and theology. You were talking about how we have to bring our entire selves. So tell me a little bit more about that, because I found that to be fascinating.
So, so I'm a PhD student right now at the Lutheran Seminary here in Chicago, and my PhD research is on intersectionality and evangelism. And one of the things that I think is really important to talk about in conversations about addressing bias within a community. The reason why churches have such a hard time trying to become more accepting of diversity, give a little bit of history here. So in 1984 or 85, thereabouts, 84? The ELCA made this decision when they formed. It's pretty impressive how they got to this point too, but where they wanted to specifically address the fact that they were so white. And so they made it a goal that from the start of when the ELCA officially launched in 1988, within 10 years of then, that 10% of their membership would be non-white, non-mother tongue Spanish. 10% non-white, non-mother tongue English. We have yet to get that goal, despite millions of dollars spent, despite Lord knows how many studies done, and it has now been 32 years. And so there's something there that goes much deeper than people are studying, and I think this is really important to talk about. In sociology, we have this term that says it's called homophily. Homophily is really simply explained: birds of a feather flock together. People who resemble each other, the more they resemble each other, the more likely they're going to congregate together. And what I try to talk about is that in many respects, that's a good thing. I mean, if you're having a really hard time with your marriage, or you're having a hard time at work, or you don't know what you want to do with your life, or you have to deal with these things, you're more likely going to be able to find somebody who can relate to your experiences and to give you the love and the care that you need. And I truly believe that this is a glue by which the Holy Spirit functions. It's kind of a conduit for her presence, that it helps to increase love between people. It helps to increase the patience, right? Because of course you resemble this person's your brother or your sister or sibling. The problem is that people, when they talk about becoming more accepting of diversity, they don't want to talk about why they don't really want to be diverse. They don't talk about why they like being homogenous, because either they're ashamed to admit it, or because they're afraid that they're going to get in trouble and labeled for being racist or whatever. And I'm not saying that they aren't racist, they aren't biased, but like, you have to say these things. But it isn't until you as a community become honest talking about why it is you're so homogenous, why it is you want to stay that way, because that's why you've been like this, despite the fact that you had a Hispanic ministry here for 5 years and you shelled out 60 grand over the course of 3 of those years, and then you bub up. Like, you know, you have to look at these things, or else you're never going to change. And as a Lutheran, I believe in confession. And so what I think congregations can do is, when they really talk amongst these, we're talking like heart-to-heart talks, and don't use sociological language. Don't talk to me about systems of oppression. Yes, those exist, but you are buying in individually into these biases. You are buying in individually to racism. You are buying in individually to heterosexism. And so you need to sit down with one another, the people in your community, and to talk about why it is you like the community the way it is, why on some level you don't really want it to change. You be honest about that to yourself and to your neighbor, and then you all together take that as an offering to God. That's where the sociology comes in. And I guarantee you, you have a conversation like that with yourself, with your community, with your pastors, with your co-parishioners. You be honest about the ways that your love for each other is actually keeping you from loving more people, and then you bring that to God and ask for repentance and healing, you're probably going to have a sea shift. You may not necessarily change to the point that, you know, you can let in everybody, right? But at the very least, it will probably make you not only more aware of your bias, but when you are more aware of that, and God is intervening to change these things in you, in your heart, in your community, in your spirit. When you have people of color, when you have queer folk come and visit, chances are you're less likely going to be saying and doing things that'll make them want to leave. That's my wife, everyone. But it starts there. It starts by being honest about why you like being so homogenous. Being honest about that, having a conversation with your neighbor, your pastor, and then bringing all of those things to God and asking for help. That's usually my recommendation.
I love that. It really does start with knowing yourself and knowing what biases you have. You know, going through a counseling program and going through seminary, one thing we do is look deeply into ourselves, because we have to know how we tick and know how we work, so that I, as a therapist, don't take my problems into a counseling room in order to fix me. And as a pastor, not to go into a room and tell people exactly how to believe. So I really like knowing yourself moving forward. And I'm going to take one moment to say that at the top of the hour, we will be going to questions and answers, so that if anyone has a question they would like to ask, go into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, type in your question, and at the top of the hour, Megan is going to come back and feed us the questions, and you can direct them to one of us or all 3 of us, or but we want to take your questions at the top of the hour. Padre Angel, what is your opinion about how, about the bias and what Francisco was talking about?
I think that I have to be honest and say that at times I just lose hope. I lose hope because I feel that those who own the power and the structures that allow them to exist are just too strong. And with all honesty, I feel exhausted. I you know, it's an overwhelming feeling of quite a very human, perhaps sinful disinterest. You know, at times there is a lot of me that just wishes to give up, you know, and I think that what keeps me going, of course, is the gospel, and it's Jesus Christ. I'm believing in the transformative power of the word that we preach. All in this to say that that precisely there is a lot that we can look, that we already have in our own theological convictions, that I think not only convict us, but also serve us perhaps as the pie forzado, as the very impulse to change and to see our neighborhoods and to see the communities at large and to see the paradigms that we have built for ourselves for what they are, a fantasy, that we were never intended to be this homogeneous, that the truth that has set us free is the truth that Jesus Christ has died for our sins, and he's alive for you and for me, for all of us, and that the reason we are church together is for the sake of the world that is most immediate around us. People constantly ask me, how can we be more open or more inclusive? In this case, how can we work with that bias? I can't help but to look at the communities that we have right here. One of the great, awesome things, one of the things that make America great is the diversity and how it's almost everywhere. The people that do not have a color diversity will have culture diversity, and those who don't have color and cultural diversity will have socioeconomical diversity, and those who don't have either of those will have religious diversity. How can we see our neighbor and not be interested in them? So to me, it's that holy curiosity, and then that dignity that our theology proclaims, that belongs to every human being, that openness to meet them and then to allow them to change us, because it is good, salutary.
Amen. And I think that's one thing that we always have to keep foremost, that each one of us is a devoted disciple of Christ. That we don't do this work in order to become rich or famous. We do this because we are charged to proclaim the gospel. That's our ministry. And it doesn't matter to whom we preach. It's the fact that we are preaching the gospel of love and inclusion by our Lord Jesus Christ. And so that's the beginning and the end. But there's a lot in the middle. And the one question that Megan had brought up, and that it keeps coming up to me, is what are the things are you tired of people asking you? What should people just like do the research themselves? Are there any questions that you just like hear and just like, yeah, I'm done?
But are you a Lutheran? Like, you grew up Catholic, right? Because you're from Puerto Rico. Lots of people are Catholic there, so. Oh, wow, you speak English? Huh. You're very articulate when you were preaching.
And for me, you know, after my grandparents died, we just spoke English at home. And so my Spanish withered away. So my Spanish is elementary at best. So people is like, well, can you translate this for me into Spanish? Are you going to do a Spanish mass? I'm like, no, I get by with English and bad English.
Yep.
That's it. That's all I got. Well, aren't you a Garcia? Well, yeah, but I don't speak Spanish.
Yeah, isn't that great?
How can we do a Latino ministry here?
Mm-hmm.
How
Yeah,
can we start?
so
We want a Latino ministry here.
Yeah,
Give us that free advice.
exactly.
mm-hmm.
Hey, can you translate this work? We ain't gonna pay you anything for that work. It's not like you're doing the binder. We pay for the binders and for everything else, but not for the translation work. Can you do that for us for free? It's the church.
Fuck you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, can we put you in a position like mission developer, and then you'll see all your colleagues get a raise every year, but mission developers don't really get raised. So we're gonna put you among your people. And wait, what do you mean you're complaining? You should be thankful. You should turn around and say thank you for having a first call without much problem. Most of your kind don't get a first call.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna interrupt here because I'm gonna have the answer that doesn't quite fit in. I usually never. I take it as kind of a duty in part. Like I mentioned earlier, as a queer Latino, but as a white passing, straight passing queer Latino, there are some things I haven't had to suffer. So even though they are not pleasant conversations and they can turn painful, I see that as part of my duty to be the one to answer any question that's put to me, if it means that other people don't. The one thing, however, I will not stand for if you say to me is that I'm not a real Latino. Because I've had some white folks, I will hear that from other Latinos. I'll get mad and I'll throw something at them, but I will at least hear it. I've heard that certainly from African Americans, and I get where they're coming from. So I will take that from them. I will not take that from some gringo. I will not take that. And so long as we're having conversations where you are inquiring about something that you're genuinely curious about and you want to be able to ask an awkward question, and you're willing to actually hear what I have to say, I will answer questions that are put to me just about no matter what they are, but never for 2 minutes assume that that means it's because I'm sympathetic to your position.
Mm-hmm.
Never do that for 2 minutes. Me showing mercy and love does not mean I'm sympathetic to your position. Me showing love to you as your brother in Christ does not mean I condone what you do. It's just, I understand as part of my call, I'm the person that is allowed to carry a burden that other folks can't and really should never have to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's my response.
Mm-hmm. And honestly, I get more questions about being transgender than I do about being Latina. And I kind of mirror Francisco in that I will answer almost every question that somebody has asked me about being transgender. And I always say, if you ask me, be prepared for the unvarnished truth. So I will tell you exactly what I think, and it might not be what you think. It might not be pretty. And I can't speak for every transgender person in the world. And I can't speak for all the Latinos. All I can do is speak for me. But so much of the time we're put in a position that's like, well, tell us what Latinas think. Tell us what transgender people think. And I'm like, I can't. I'm just me.
I'll tell you, for me too, even one of the most disturbing things I ever experienced in my entire life, I was at a church face thing with the ELCA, and it was a bunch of white folks. There was one table of Latinos, and it was great. We were like the naughty table. We were the ones constantly joking and like, making noise. It was great. But at one point, we all said the Our Father, and it was interesting. We were saying there, and just about everybody, including all these white folks, were saying the Our Father in Spanish. And I remember thinking, like, I did not like that feeling at all. And then I waited along, and I realized, like, oh, that's right, because you all are a bunch of colonizers. You just learned this language to help to, like, hide the fact that you control everything. And it's just like, the visceral tension in my body at that moment was so high And I'm certain that everybody, somebody even said, well, did you see how we all said it in Spanish? And I said, yes, and it terrified me. The person didn't give me any follow-up question. But like, that's cosmetic. Like,
Yes.
I'm still at the table. There are only like a handful of Latinos, and there are like 300 people here. This is colonized Mexico, right? That we're in. And like, you mean to tell me you guys aren't usurpers? How many of our parishioners in our communities are the ones that are cleaning your houses? How would you guys have been dealing with my cousins had they come to visit you? I mean, it's like, yeah. Anyway, I just figure I would share that. That was because that was a visceral moment for me. Which is, oh, look, the colonizer is they're singing this. They're singing the songs of Babylon, if I could say, like.
Yep.
That's the one song, you know. Sing us the songs of Babylon. Sing us a song sing us the songs from Jerusalem, from Israel. Sing us the songs of your people. And it's like, well, how can we do that? Here they were singing our songs in the river in Babylon, and it roasted me to the core. Big realization that day.
Francisco, has it ever happened to you when you're in a big service and suddenly the gospel acclamation is Ale, 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 and of course it's off key and really bad, and then and then everybody turns to look at you, the token Latino that's been invited here, and everybody's like, we're singing your stuff, look at us, we're good stuff. And then in the midst of the offertory or something, maybe the presider comes and says, will you say the Lord's Prayer in Spanish? That will be really meaningful. Really meaningful. And I'm like, see, my whole culture is like a rosary bead. We're an enhancer. Like, we enhance your experience. You know, I am, as we talk about issues of worship, I am reminded that the last worship resource in Spanish published officially by the ELCA was Libro, over 20 years ago, about 25. In that period, not only they went through the renewing worship, published the ELW, and now a new purple thing is coming. In all that period, Libro is like a bad translation of the LBW, and the people that were part of it could not even put the Virgin of Guadalupe as a holy day there. It's not included into it. Maybe for the next time, if they ever have some money for Latinos, maybe they'll just trust the Latino Lutherans to do it alone with the white people in it.
I have popped up because there is a relevant question from the audience, and I'll be the one who tries to ask this in a way that sees what happens next.
Okay.
So there is a question that is, so say there is a service and there is no Latinx leader. Is there a way that people can incorporate singing hymns that are in Spanish, or prayers or liturgy or celebrations into their service that would feel better?
Would you feel better for who?
I don't know. The question, feeling better isn't about the that's not what the person added, but because we've just listened to you, I'll talk about how it feels when it's not working, right?
Sure.
Are there ways that people could have it go better?
Well, I mean, for me, that's the thing. Who? I know the person who's asking the question somewhere is talking about cultural appropriation. To be perfectly honest, that is a moot point for me. If you guys want to sing songs in Spanish, fine. I'm certain there are plenty of you that know the words to Bésame Mucho, right? So like, I don't necessarily see a problem with singing songs in the original language. I've done that. I was at a really amazing Lutheran church in Geneva, Switzerland, with 39 different languages and 47 different nationalities. And so we sang music literally from all these countries in the world. We were also very ecumenical. So there's nothing wrong with singing songs in different languages, if that's what you want to do. If you're trying to make a point, like you want to show how open you are, as opposed to you genuinely enjoying and embracing and finding life in songs that come from Spanish-speaking communities, that's great. For me, the problem is if you think that is it a works righteousness thing. That's a very Lutheran term. It's the idea that if we do something, it proves our goodness and our righteousness before God. If you're doing Spanish stuff in your worship because you think it's, even if you don't even have Spanish speaking people there, because you think that's what you're supposed to do, no. And the first thing I would say is like talk with the Hispanics, talk with the Latino folks in your congregation if they want to do that, if that's something that's important. And if you don't, really listen to them. But I don't necessarily, for me, the idea that an Anglo congregation could sing a song or do a prayer or whatever right, that feels right, sounds disingenuous. It's like, who are you doing it for? If you're doing it for your own devotion, fine. I wasn't raised speaking Spanish, but when I say the Lord's Prayer in Spanish, it feels very different than when I say it in English. And and there's a reason why on my altar, this is all my Hispanic family. So for me, it's an internal thing. But I also understand that on some level, this entire culture is adopted. I wasn't raised this way. I came to it later, understanding it as part of my birthright. But there is something to say for finding value in it, even if that's not the culture you come from. But that would be the only caveat I would say, is that if you're doing it, the way that you're doing it right is because you're doing it sincerely, because you find that the Spirit moves in you especially that way, not because you're trying to prove your multicultural cred.
Yeah. Go ahead, Padre.
No,
Padre.
when I address issues of worship, I think that worship should be reverently done, should be intentionally done, and most and above all should be done without fuss. And so my concern when thinking of singing or adopting things from other culture is, as Francisca said, not only my intentions with it. Is it some form of virtual signaling? As Francisca said, what I want to say is like, so that I am the cool padre that sings in Swahili. Look at that, we're so worldly, and I'm just like so smart, and the church is so global. Or is there an agenda beyond that is about bringing forth liberation? Before we sing Ale, Ale, Alleluia, perhaps are we sharing that it comes from the Caribbean? Do we share how is it sung there? Do we honor it? It's the same thing with African American spirituals. Are we acknowledging the reality of how many of these songs are produced? And what is it that allows us to have them? The baptismal covenant, our common baptism. That our communities are people of the water and the word. So how do we then not only acknowledge that reality, but use the opportunity then to bring forth liberation and to lift up the issues that ought to be brought up? And that is not just some pretty. If it's some like ELCA church-wide assembly stuff, then don't do it that way, please. Don't do it like that. That's just bad stuff.
And I go back, I agree with both of you that the reason why you would bring in a different language into your service, you need to know why. And I really liked when you said, Francisco, does it just improve your cred? If you have something in Spanish, then that means you're more diverse? No. It just means somebody convinced somebody that it would be a good idea. My bishop, the Bishop Jim Gonia from Rocky Mountain Synod, has had, before he became bishop, he had a 10-year relationship. He lived in Madagascar. So he will periodically bring in prayers from Madagascar at Synod assemblies. And typically it is associated with the fact that we have representatives from Madagascar there, and our Synod actively supports the Madagascar Church. I think that's a good reason why we should sing songs and say prayers in the language from Madagascar if we are supporting that church. If we are doing a Spanish song just because you have a pastor named Garcia and you want to make her happy, well, let's just sing something in Spanish. It'll make Pastor Nicole happy. I'm like, well, why are we singing the song? Is there a reason for it? That it should be in Spanish rather than English? And it'll confuse people. Why are we doing it just to make somebody feel happy? Or is it really an expression of our love for Jesus Christ and how we are devoted to Jesus Christ? And if that song has something special, then we should sing it. I remember growing up in the Catholic Church, we would have mariachi masses all the time, and I was part of the mariachi choir. And there are some songs that I just absolutely love and would like to bring them into my congregation. I would love to say the colores at some point, but it would be just like Padre said, I would introduce it. This is why we're singing this song, and this is what it means to me. And it means to me being brought up in a church where I felt loved and supported and close to Christ. And it's the foundation and the beginning of why I'm standing here as your pastor, because I was nurtured by a congregation in love. And that's what I want to create here, de colores.
Yeah,
that's how I would introduce it.
And it's so beautiful because when we then engage these elements as just part of our DNA and we incorporate them in the life of the church, then they become like St. Lucy for the Swedes. You know, I've been in St. Lucy celebrations. It's the same thing. And the pastor stands up front and says, we're doing St. Lucy. We're doing it because it's a Swedish church. Nobody here has been to Sweden, but this is a Swedish church, you know, and we are going to do the St. Lucy because that's what we've done before. And it's embedded with beauty and meaning and spirituality, and it brings people together. And all that we're saying is give to our traditions the same respect.
Yes.
The same respect.
Because I know there's one Swedish tradition where a girl wears flowers on her head. But yeah, that's it. Yes, in Lucia. Yeah. And I've seen that. I'm like, well, that's interesting. Yeah. I didn't know all y'all had all these costumes. Thought you were all just white.
Yeah. Well, here's the irony, though, is that Santa Lucia actually comes from, I believe, from Sicily. So It's actually not a white thing. It comes from the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm. But that's what we need to know. There really aren't white people per se. There are Norwegians or Swedes or Germans. There are English. People forget that they have these deep cultural ties that kind of got brushed away when people came here to the United States. And I think people should remember where you come from.
Yes.
Remember who your people were and why they came to the United States and what their life was back in the old country. You need to know that.
Yeah, totally agree.
You know, and I have
interesting too, because when parishes, that's something that I'll do when I go to talk about diversity with a congregation. Is one of the first things I try to do is a little bit of historical research before I go there. And invariably, you always have that one person that's like 70, 80 years old that knows the history of that particular church, what the immigrants were dealing with, what they had to put up with, what they went through. And usually that's the first, they're expecting to hear me talk about diversity, but I first talk about them. And then you find a way to make the connection, like you said. What's the connection between the story of injustice and pain that led to the founding of this church? And don't you realize that you have immigrant communities that are still feeling that exact same pain these days? That just like your great-grandparents met at a factory, that these parents also met at a meat processing plant, or they met because they were working at the same construction site. It's exactly the same story.
Yeah. And it's a minute or two after 4. So I just want to make sure Pastor Megan, want to check in with Pastor Megan to see if there are any questions that people want to bring up.
Yes. You were speaking during the presentation about there being a bit of some exhaustion when there are a few Latinx leaders who have to serve on all the committees and all the boards and being on all the positions of authority. And maybe, Padre, this is something you can speak about with your upcoming transition, but do you believe that there are ways that we can have a path forward that is less exhausting for our Latinx leaders, that brings more diversity, but less of the burden on the shoulders of a few?
Absolutely. And I think that I want to go back to the concept of socializing the power, of making sure that more people with more diverse and intersectional backgrounds have access to economical resources, to money, to the distribution of money, and to make sure that they are also the decision makers. One person at Synod Council or 2 people at Synod Council does not make it. You know, I've been a mission developer for 6 years. In 6 years in my synod, there has never been anybody at the synod office that's a person of color. Only recently there is an openly gay man. There is nobody, and it's like, how can we then talk about engage in diversity if the decision makers are not diverse themselves? It is at the end of the day similar to all marketing, right? If we're doing marketing for women, the most disastrous of them tend to be made by men. The most successful of them tend to be made by other women that may have the same interests. So if we want to be successful and engage in the diverse church, we need the stakeholders and we need the people in power to be diverse too. And how can we do that? At the very practical level, the bishops, when the bishops have an opening for an assistant to the bishop, they can be intentional in recruiting people of color. They don't have to be white. They could be from other parts of the synod, the DEMs. The bishop, the presiding bishop, at her level, how many of her assistants to the presiding bishop are people of color? How many of them, their primary language is not other than English? I know those of ones who are, then we keep going to the layers of power. How many of the secretaries? How many of the heads of departments? How many of the people that are at the logistical side, the ones that answer the phone, and so forth and so on. No, and to I don't want to say trickle down diversity. What I mean is revolutionary diversity, something that that is exercised at the top, in the middle, and the bottom.
And we have to work really hard at encouraging and supporting individuals in the congregations and make the candidacy process accessible. Candidacy for me was just horrific. And it felt like I was always, and Francisco, more than a few times we've been on the phone and he talked me out of not leaving seminary or the candidacy process.
Well, candidacy is horrible and traumatic.
But I would totally understand if you would have left, Nicole. I wouldn't have argued. I mean, and Angel, I'm totally behind you 100%.
Yes, and then
I understand. Trust me, I understand.
Yeah, and nobody changes. And what you talk about it, I talk about it. The clergy get together and we all talk what a shit show the candidacy process is, and nobody does anything to change it. The bishops know, they just don't care. And the reason they don't care is because, and I had a bishop once tell me that it is not a right, that you're not entitled to be ordained. Which is true. Nobody's entitled to ordination, and we ordain whoever we want, and we make the processes that we want, and we can't just cooperate that. It won't work that way. Well, that's the attitude. It won't work.
I would have pushed back against that bishop and said, if they say you don't have the right to ordain, you don't have the right to be ordained, I would say, you opened the door, I did all your tests, I did all the things. You owe me. I have spent Lord knows how many years of my life. I have gone through anxiety and exams and psychological evaluations just so I could be at the point that you would take to show that I am willing to work within an institution to do this. What do you mean you don't owe me help in getting a call? I find that preposterous. Because if you make the sacrifice and you do the work and show that you are willing to work within an institutional confine and make the sacrifices consistently, whereas other people, right, you know how that saying is the same, right? You know, people of color, we have to work twice as much, twice as hard to get half as much. That's true in candidacy too. So if you do all of that, I think people absolutely have the right to say, hell yeah, I deserve a call. I have put in the effort, I have put in the work, and how dare you talk to me like that and deny your duties to me as one of your parishioners, as one of your ordination candidates, and you, my bishop, how dare you say that?
And the reason they're there, Francisco, is because there's no accountability. Because if tomorrow a candidacy committee or a bishop decide that a person won't be ordained, that's the end of it. There's nowhere they can go. There's nobody that's going to defend. They will talk to other clergy, including myself, who will say, wow, that sucks. Can't even imagine how hard it is. We can't do anything. We can do anything. They have the power of the keys. And if you become too much a troublemaker, we will share with one another in those phone calls. You know, and you know that that's happening behind the scenes. People in candidacy are some of the most vulnerable in the process of our church. They are at the mercy of a church that so often is not friendly. And it's not the same, you know, how all of us, you know, have had the seminary experience. So we also know that it depends what synod you are. You know what's frustrating? Being mistreated in one synod and having somebody else with the exact same circumstance having a breeze to candidacy. Because in their synod, there's no problem with it. And one thinking, oh, I should have gone through that synod as opposed to my synod.
Yeah, and my candidacy committee, I think they just didn't understand me. And, you know, I remember being called stubborn, and I lacked humility. And I just stared at them and said, how the hell do you think I got here?
Exactly.
I had to be stubborn. I had to preach because I'm the only person who would advocate for me. And you're calling me stubborn and I lack humility?
Right.
It's like, no. And what they were making me do, jump through all these hoops. I'm like, I jumped and I jumped and I jumped. And finally, at one point, I said, enough, I'm done. And that's when I had a bunch of my friends who were pastors said, you just need to do it. You just need to do it. That's all you can do. Because otherwise, it's over. They'll never let you back. So I reached out and I cried to Francisco and, you know, a dozen other friends, and made it through, including Pastor Megan, because, yeah, it's a closed system run by people who went to seminary 25 years ago and have no idea what it's like out there right now.
Padre, you were speaking before we started our conversation about why you're moving to the Episcopal Church. And I wondered if you would share that with those who are listening.
Absolutely. It's been a long process. I think that is, I call it my second coming out in terms of something that I knew inside of me that I finally felt empowered enough to share with the world. I could give you a lot of platitudes that are true. The Book of Common Prayer, the liturgy, and all those things that make me fall in love with Anglican tradition spirituality. But what has pushed me outside of the ELCA, first is racism. I have no illusion that the Episcopal Church is free from racism, far from it. But the lack of leadership that looks like me, the lack of opportunity, and seeing myself stuck at this time, seeing that the more time passes, the wider it seems to get, and that other than being unless I felt that unless I became just a pet of the denomination, there was really no way of progress or doing different things, because it's been decided for me. I think I love that I go to clergy meetings with the Episcopalians, and that I am not the only clergy of color, like it happens here in Massachusetts. I'm not the only one whose primary language is Spanish. I'm not the only one that's brown and gay. You know, there is not just one trans person. You know, there are more than one. There may be three, but there are more than just one. And that diversity and the embrace and the feeling that they have my back. That when there is an issue with race, they are quick to respond. You know, recently, I remember Bishop Gene Robinson carrying the remains of Matthew Shepard into the National Cathedral, where presidents are, their wakes happen, and state people. And he said, Matthew, welcome home. And that was a bold public statement. I remember the words of Bishop Michael Terry saying we may become a smaller denomination. Actually, we may disappear, but that's okay because the church belongs to Jesus Christ, and we're going to be bold in what we believe and preach, and we're not going to be afraid to die. And to me, that sounded like gospel. I see the resources that are put, and of course, there could be plenty of more resources. The Episcopalians are loaded with money, but I see the amount of resources that are put, financial resources, concrete resources, into the Spanish speaking communities and into other diverse communities. And I'm excited about it. I feel, you know, I see right now I've been named the priest in charge in a congregation, and the assistant priest is a man from Uganda who's also my age. And here we are, both of us leading these two communities, Ugandans and Latinos. And we are the ones as priests in the positions of power. And I couldn't help but think this could never happen in the LCA. It would be unthinkable. It would be too much work. It would break their brains to think that way. So that has been a big part of the process for me. I think I just lost hope in the denomination, because in a big part, my convictions haven't changed. I still believe in justification. Grace still works for me. You know, I still read the book of Conquer, and I go like, good stuff. You know, but that wasn't just enough. I finally came to the realization that I also deserve to be happy, and that I deserve to not be stressed all the time.
May I just second that? Yes, you deserve to be happy.
Thank you.
Yeah. The next question I have is about the church's role in ordination and immigration status. It's the person who has typed the question says, employment laws shouldn't matter for ordination. Do we know if we have DACA students or others with irregular immigration status who would want to serve the church on a roster if that requirement was changed?
There are people who are currently in candidacy who are DACA recipients or who are undocumented. However, synods are frequently slightly at loggerheads as to what to do because of federal requirements. And of course, there's just the reality that for too many people in church leadership, having an undocumented person in your system is not worth the trouble. And then of course, then there are the candidates themselves who, especially with our current state of our country, don't even know if they want to even bother, because what if they start preaching and then ICE brings in and handcuffs them and drags them out and deports them back to their home countries where they can't come back for 10 years, even if they've been in the country since they were 2 or 3 years old. And I even think about, I especially think of Pastor Betty Drandon, who was here in Chicago. And I had known Pastor Betty for years. We had been in seminary together. We'd interacted a lot. And how it broke my heart, because she was always telling me, well, I'm going to be talking with this person about this. Oh, I'm going to be meeting with this person about getting ministry things here. There was also a fair amount of sexism that she had to deal with, but I'm not going to touch on that, at least not here. And but she was constantly looking for church officials or church authorities to help to give her a leg up so that she could get a job and get her, you know, start working on her papers. And she came here as a refugee, mind you. Well, clearly, you know, her time ran out. And because they had her information, because her daughter actually is DACA, they knew where to find her. And they not only arrested everybody in the house, but they tried even to arrest the 5-year-old granddaughter, I should say, her daughter's daughter. And I mean, if you're pursuing ordination and you're undocumented, I mean, these are the things you have to keep in mind. And that is a horrific burden to have to carry. So if if they're undocumented folks that want to do that, more power. Synods need to support them completely and thoroughly. I think they have every right to be here. But it's a horrific uphill task because the sacrifices and the risks are way beyond what most of us are used to having to deal with pursuing the ordination process, because literally you could be an undocumented pastor and preaching in your church, and if ICE decided to come in, they could do it and take you and cart you away. Not to mention if you live in the parsonage and they have your address. That's how bad it is right now.
Or if one of your parishioners is upset about your sermon and decides to make a phone call. But also in all of this, yes, I know, to answer the question, yes, I know of people too that are in candidacy today, and people who will wish to serve, but their immigration status is a barrier. I can't help but to think that ordination is a spiritual thing, that if the church really wanted it to do it, it could do it without much problem. Francisca hit the point, but there are people in power that don't want the trouble. And the reason I wonder if they don't want the trouble is because taking a stand on the side of the immigrant, the oppressed, means losing the finances from the states where they're more conservative in the American sense of the word, that are more Republicans, that support more the Trump administration policies, and they are afraid that people are going to say the church is now a bunch of Democrats and we're going to take our money away. And they are afraid of losing the money because they think with their belly, or with the old Adam, to be a Lutheran in that way. When Pastor Betty's situation happened, I kept wondering why my presiding bishop is not on CNN talking and denouncing it. Why aren't there like people being, but we don't know how to manage media. We don't want to engage in that. We prefer to be bold. And that's not the proclamation that we are invited to do. We are invited to be bold, and the invitation is always come and die. And if my siblings, the come and die for them mean that they will preach the gospel with the risk that they may be arrested, then I'll have their back. The come and die for me is like, I'll have your back. And I trust God that I won't go bankrupt, and that something will appear, but I will have your back. But that's just a lot of work. It's easier to be distracted with paperwork and with social statements that mean nothing, and with resolutions that make us feel like we're changing the world.
Yeah.
Another question that we have is if you could share with us the origins of the decolonized Lutheranism movement.
So goodness. So make a long story short, decolonized Lutheranism, technically, the impetus behind it first began as a tongue-in-cheek response to old Lutherans' campaign. You know you might be a Lutheran if. And so they had a series of memes saying, you know you might be a Lutheran if you put a fork in your purse because you know there might be a potluck after church. You might be a Lutheran if you have Jell-O molds, you have Jell-O the color of the liturgical seasons. And there was then a pastor, Norwegian American background, he's originally from a Lutheran church in Davenport, Iowa, who at that point was pastoring at a mission congregation right on the border with Texas, between Texas and Mexico. For any of you who read the book Like Water for Chocolate, it talks about two cities, Piedras Negras and Eagle Pass. That's where the doctor, David Pass, lived in the book. Well, this pastor, Paul Bailey, was pastoring in Eagle Pass, Texas. And he saw that and he was furious. And so he made two tongue-in-cheek responses. So here's an Anglo pastor, but pastoring in a Hispanic context, where he said, you know you might be a Lutheran if you have to choose between chapurrade or pozole for posada. So these are two different kinds of soup for posada, which is a holiday you find in a Mexican American celebrating the night that Mary and Joseph were looking for him at the end. Or he had another one that said, you know you might be a Lutheran if your vacation Bible school snack is posadas. He did that, and then all of a sudden there was an explosion of other people from different communities making similar memes in the same theme. everything that was including Indian food or Mexican food or food from Tanzania, and it kind of went off from there. And at that point, Elle Dowd, who is now doing her vicarage at St. Luke's Lutheran Church here in Chicago, she's actually at my home congregation, she made a similar meme and then put up the hashtag decolonize Lutheranism. And just kind of a whim, I imagine. And I then saw that. And a year before this, so this is the spring of 2016, 2015, that spring, one of my professors, who's an old school liberation theologian, a guy named Jose David Rodriguez, he's here in Chicago. He is from Puerto Rico. He is, like I said, old school liberation theologian. And he had preached this knockout sermon where he talked about what it was like really wrestling with whether or not he wanted to bother being with the church. Because it's a tool of colonialism and violence. Why should I be engaged? But a man who was a visiting professor that year was a Jesuit priest who had been active in a lot of liberation struggles, older man, in Latin America. And they were having this conversation, and he basically told him, son, what makes you think that you know what God wants? And so I hear him preach the sermon, and like 3 or 4 days later, we have a sit-down conversation. I tell him, why the hell should I stay? They treat me like shit. They barely look at me. I have to keep myself transparent so people don't beat the crap out of me and make problems for me. Why should I stay? He didn't answer my question. But what he did say was, well, what you have to do, you need to figure out what it is your work, and then you wait until conditions are right. And when conditions are right, you jump. And so when I saw this online conversation going from images to text to tweets and conversations, I thought, that's it. And so many of the people who were involved in this conversation are people that I had known for a while. And so I literally just started a Facebook message thread. And I said, okay, guys, here's what we have to do. We're gonna have a gathering in Chicago. We're gonna call it Decolonize Lutheranism. We'll have it this fall, and we'll have it at the Lutheran Seminary. And that's what we did. And from that, this rather blessed group of people, we were able to come together and to really raise the tenor of what this means for this discussion. What does it mean to decolonize Lutheranism? Can Lutheranism be decolonized? What does that mean to have churches that are attentive not only to differences of race, but also to gender and to sexuality and to ability and disabilities? We started inserting conversations around disability as well, because we understood that invariably, as the saying goes, if none of us are, if all of us aren't free, none of us are free. And that's what we did for the better part of about 2.5 years. But over time, you know, everybody's interests sort of split. I had to get on with my PhD studies, but there are lots of people who still are very much interested in this, and who are making efforts on a local level to really talk about these things. What does it mean for us to be really attentive to differences of race and gender and sexuality, everything, so we can have churches that really can embrace everybody? What does it mean to understand what are the ways that we in the church try to turn people into things so we can profit off of them? Be it ordaining all of these young white people to essentially be sacrificed on the altars of the nostalgia of toxic congregations so synods can stay alive. What does it mean for us to turn seminarians of color into a product, right? So we can have them in the photo shoot, we can lift them up during ordination processes, but we neglect to tell them that, you know, if you're a woman of color, you're going to be waiting usually about 2 years for your first call. And that if you're a man of color, you have to make sure that you never show agency or your passion or your energy, or else white women are going to come at you. And white men too, with their backup. So what does it mean then to have a Lutheran community, and specifically we're talking about decolonization, that does not see the people in the church as subjects or products of the empire to be sold? for the sake of maintaining the empire. We are not people to be sacrificed. We are not products for, for your virtue signaling. We are children of God. And that is sort of where I am now when I talk about what it means to decolonize Lutheranism. What does it mean for us? Because for me, decolonization is really about money, right? What are the ways that we as a church turn people into things? Even Paul Tillich talks about this, the thingification of people. What are the ways that the ELCA turns its pastors, its seminarians, its parishioners, its bishops into things that are then leveraged for the sake of maintaining a church empire that benefits only a very, very, very select few of people, where all the rest of us are shackled and have to produce for the sake of the empire? That's ultimately the question that I tend to ask. I have an essay coming out soon. I have a lot of writing that I've been doing on this question in the last year and a half. So, and there's a website that kind of, there's actually a video. Have you seen this video, Pastor Megan?
I think so, yeah.
There's a video that actually literally spells the entire history out in about 2 minutes. And it does it much better and obviously much more brilliantly than me. So if you could put that link up for someone.
Okay, will do. I like you just the way you are, so.
Well, thank you, Pastor. I appreciate it.
What is better? That would be what I would ask back to you. The thing that I was thinking about as you were speaking is that this town hall actually is occurring because we had a resolution that was going before the Sierra Pacific Synod, where we were going to ask the Synod to start creating some of the accountability of all the resolutions and all the strategic plans and all the documents that we have put forward throughout the decades on how to be better when it comes to decreasing bias. And our Synod Assembly was moved, obviously due to the coronavirus, in part because our Synod has a bishop's election coming up, and that's just real hard to figure out all those laws. But what it meant is that there was this artificial weight that this accountability was going to have. And so instead, along with those who are in the racial ethnic ministry team for our Synod, we decided that this would be a gift. Instead of needing the Synod's permission to do all the steps that we were asking for, we could just start doing them. And we had kind of 3 steps we wanted to do. One was to hold town halls with diverse folk. So we'll be doing those over the next couple of months. The second was to create a congregational toolkit, collecting all these resources that people are sharing through these conversations and through the work that's been done forever. And then the third step, to have the Synod actually create a system of accountability where maybe it audits its own policies and procedures, and people are able to provide feedback on how to make things better. And so I'm really grateful that you all are taking that bold step with the Spirit, remembering that we are the Synod, even without the Synod voting. And the question I forgot to ask before we started, and I'll make it my final question, is there someone who's willing to pray to close out our conversation today?
Thank you, Francisco, for praying for us.
Thank you, Francisco.
Okay, so in the many languages, the many feelings, and the many manners in which we do so, let us come together in humility and in openness to God. Dear Lord, I spend so much of my time angry with you, reminding you of all of the times that you do not help us when we fail, reminding you of all of the times that you say that you will be there for us, and yet we have to wait. But I also thank you for the times that you bring me and others together in times where we can really truly see some of the great diversity and brilliance that exists in your created world. Thank you very much for bringing all of us together on this panel today. Thank you for giving me time to hang out with a couple of other Latinos locals in mi iglesia, because it's good for my spirit. But most importantly, thank you for setting aside this time and bringing folks together to come and learn about what it means to really become your church in the fullest sense. That shows the level of attentiveness and care that your Son showed to so many of us. And it is in this name that we pray, Jesus the Christ. Amen.
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 Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll be
Thank
back
you,
again
everyone.
next
Have a
Friday.
good night. Take care. This was
The
fun.
Sierra Pacific Synod Youth Committee will be with us next week, and who knows what the youth are going to do. So it's going to be a lovely time. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Blessings, everyone. Bye-bye.